want to talk today about my 10 favorite fantasy series of all time. It's such a subjective thing, and it's probably going to change as I read more books. And the criteria of this are pretty simple. I have to have read 2 books in the series to make it on the list. I can't just read the first one. So you're going to have some series that I haven't completed on here, and I think if I were to limit this to just 10 completed series, that would eliminate several of these because a couple of these I haven't finished all the books in yet. They make it in here based on my enjoyment of them so far. Again, it's also very subjective, so I'm not ranking these by these are objectively the best. It is truly just here's how much I enjoy these series and how much I've connected with them in my time reading them. I'm also not going to eliminate series just because I have another series by that same author in the list. There are 2 series by one author on here. I know some people do that, and that's totally fine, but I'm not going to do that in this one. Let's jump in here with number 10. And number 10 for me is the Bloodsworn saga by John Gwynne. I have read Shadow of the Gods and Hunger of the Gods, and I have yet to grab Fury, but I think John Gwynne does something really awesome with these books. He takes Orca, who is a very strong, very terrifying female character in these books as she is searching for her child, and he writes her in a way that's sort of somewhat mysterious, but also incredibly terrifying. Like, I would not want to get into a fight with Orca. She would wreck me. But you also have the Viking historical background and color to this entire series. And you get things like Thought Cage and, references to kit and gear all over the place, which I find quite fun. The Thought Cage one is pretty funny. I mean, after you read Thought Cage like 300 times, it's like, okay. I mean, we get it. It's a brain, but Viking style. At least in my experience with Bloodsworn, it's like this nice mix of heroic fantasy with some grimmer and darker elements, and it's character focused in a way, which that's right up my alley. I like a nice grim perspective on things, but I also like heroes who go out and are heroic. And there's always like a towing of the line for me that when it really works, where you've got a hero who has some flaws but still wants to do the right thing. I think that is kind of the sweet spot for the type of characters that I'm going to really enjoy, and John Gwynne has that in spades here. Number 9 is The 5 Warrior Angels by Brian Lee Durfee. This trilogy is very different than a lot of the things I have read before. It's focusing on, well, a lot of themes, actually, now that I'm thinking about it. And you've got this young king who is terrible. He is awful and gross and just disgusting to read. And he is firm in the belief that fiery absolution is going to come upon his kingdom. And in order for him to get fiery absolution to come upon the kingdom, he basically has to surrender himself to this prince and his invading armies as they come to invade his kingdom. And so he's pretty much offering no resistance as this prince shows up and just starts wrecking his kingdom. But you've also got chosen one tropes in here, and it's twisted a bit on its head to the point where I am about halfway through the 3rd book, and I truly don't know how this whole chosen one trope is going to wrap up. Very excited to see how Brian Lee Durfee handles it. You've got a lot of classic fantasy elements in here. You've got character tropes like the chosen one, the tired swordsman, things like this that show up a lot in fantasy, but Brian Lee Durfee takes these ideas and spins them on their head more often than not. And there's a lot of political things happening and also some religious elements. These books are huge. Each book is 1,000 pages or more long. And so you get to kind of dwell in the world, which I find really enjoyable. You get to spend a lot of time here with the characters and the things that they're doing. So very curious to see how Brian Lee Durfee wraps things up. But the ending in book 1 and book 2 was 5 of 5. They were fantastically wrapped up. And he's a guy that not a ton of people know about. He's got his YouTube channel, which, by the way, great book reviews on there. He reads incredibly fast. I don't think 5 Warrior Angels has gotten its due as the masterpiece of a series that it is. Number 8 is the Kingkiller Chronicle for me, Name of the Wind and Wise Man's Fear. And I want to head this off before I get the comments that are like, the series will never be finished. You can't talk about this series because it won't be finished. I don't care about Doors of Stone. I am rating this series purely with the expectation that it will never be finished and that we just have the 2 books that we've got, and that is going to be what we get. Those 2 books are awesome. Name of the Wind, and it's one of those things where you either love it or hate it, and I know a lot of people just really can't stand it, and that's totally fine. I understand why it would be something you can't stand. But there is this eyes wide open wonder in the world that Patrick Rothfuss creates here. Kvothe is a bit of an annoying character, I'll be totally honest with you, but it is the small stories that build upon one another to create the larger narrative that I think are fantastic. I mean, you have emphasis on coinage and magic system and like everyday things and smaller stories that build upon one another that I just can't get enough of. When Kvothe has to, get some clothes or bread, or he needs some money to pay his tuition, those sorts of stories are really what draw me in because they're relatable and understandable. And you don't just have small stories, you also have bigger ones as well. And everything is sort of wrapped in this mystery and almost like fable and fairy tale. Obviously, there's some elements that aren't perfect. I mean, I don't love the fact that you have like this Mary Sue character with Kvothe, but it's the vibe that Patrick Rothfuss creates with this series that I can't get enough of. Number 7 for me is the Stormlight Archive. This one is very interesting because I read Way of Kings and Words of Radiance, and you will notice conspicuously Stormlight Archive comes in at number 7, which means that I'm probably not the biggest fan of Stormlight compared to everybody else right now. I think Stormlight Archive does some things incredibly well, like world building, lore, the Sanderlanches I think are fantastic. The things that don't quite hit for me are just the characters and the prose. That combination of character and prose, and like I just don't connect with them as well as some others do, and yet I respect what he's doing. And so there's this combination where I enjoy how the stories wrap up, and yet I also am like conflicted in how I feel about them. Stormlight at 7 is an interesting ranking because I also enjoy them and wish they did some things that they don't do at the same time, if that makes any sense. I think I've been told that Stormlight is probably not for me, and yet at the same time, the final like 300 pages of Words of Radiance just blew my face off. It's a very weird kind of confluence of things coming together with Stormlight where I think I want to like it more than I do like it, and I appreciate it more than I enjoy it. So do with that what you will. Number 6 is the Age of Madness trilogy by Joe Abercrombie. This is the second trilogy in his First Law world, following obviously the First Law trilogy, and then Age of Madness comes second. Age of Madness follows a lot of the children of characters from the First Law trilogy. On its face, that seems like a really good thing to do as like lip service to your fans. You have this connection to the previous trilogy that I think, everybody jumping into it isn't left out in the dark trying to figure out what's going on. But at the same time, it does sort of set yourself up for failure because it's like, these are tangentially related to these characters that you loved from the previous stuff, and yet they're not those characters. And so you almost have to win your audience back to what you've already done because they're coming at it from like different points of view. The story that Joe Abercrombie tells with Age of Madness, it's richly layered, and you get a lot of cool commentary on how the world is changing and capitalistic society, and there's still these elements of grim, dark tropes where you've got characters that decide they might want to be better than they have been, and yet for reasons out of their control, they can't be. Also, Wisdom of Crowds was incredible. Like the way he kind of pulls all the things together and marries them to what has already come before was like mind-bogglingly good. Wisdom of Crowds wrecked me. That bow tying everything together sort of made the trilogy for me. It reaffirms all the things that you already know about Joe Abercrombie. It kind of takes all the good stuff that happens in First Law and then tightens it up in terms of plotting with the second series. Obviously, the character work is still awesome. Dialogue is great. And yet it's a bit more finely tuned than the First Law trilogy was. Obviously, First Law Trilogy is like a bit of a lightning in a bottle sort of thing. Age of Madness is a writer that is improved doing a lot of the same things. Number 5 for me is Lord of the Rings. I think a lot of people would probably have Lord of the Rings number 1. And if you were rating series based on their impact on the genre and how important they were to the American mind, certainly Lord of the Rings is probably number 1 or number 2 on a lot of those lists. And Lord of the Rings is awesome. I respect it. I enjoy it. I love the world building, the song diatribes, the things that Tolkien focuses on. Like, it's all great. There's really nothing bad about Lord of the Rings. It's just aged. And you could argue it's aged very, very well. And I think it has, because the genre of fantasy sort of built up around all the things that Tolkien focused on. And yet fantasy has moved away from a lot of those things that Lord of the Rings does. You can't really judge Lord of the Rings based on how the genre has evolved. And yet you do sort of have to. Like, you want to judge Lord of the Rings based on its contemporaries, like C.S. Lewis, for example. You look at what Lord of the Rings was doing in its time, and it's far better, I think, than a lot of the stuff being written at the time. And yet, if you were to compare Lord of the Rings to what modern fantasy is, it's very different. And so you have to kind of set Lord of the Rings off in its own little box, because you can't judge it with modern stuff, but it's also difficult to judge it with old stuff because, like, in the 1930s and 40s and 50s, the stuff that was good at the time, we don't think is all that good comparatively. So it's a respect ranking. It is also it's the epicness. It's the battle of Minas Tirith. It's the forces of good against the forces of evil. It's everything that I think can be great about the fantasy genre in one series. And of course, nobody needs to hear this from me because everybody knows this, because we've all grown up in our collective consciousness with The Lord of the Rings. Number 4 for me is the First Law Trilogy by Joe Abercrombie. Like I said before, First Law is a bit of a lightning in a bottle sort of thing. I would love to read more Logan Ninefingers and Sandang Lokta. In fact, just as fan service, if Joe Abercrombie were to release a thing where those two are having a conversation with one another, that would be fantastic, and it would be so much fun. The character work is what sets it apart, because early on, like with the Blade itself, the plotting is not up to snuff per se. And yet Abercrombie has a quality as a writer of prose, as a writer of theme, and as a writer of character, where it doesn't as much matter what his characters are doing. It's interesting anyway. He does get his feet under him as the series goes along. Like, the Blade itself drags a bit. If he were to go back to that book now, it would be a much better book. As the series goes along, he starts to get his sea legs under him as a writer. And by the end of the series, the way things come together and the confluence of events, I think, is just excellent. He takes the idea of wizards, turns it on his head. He takes the idea of aging swordsmen, turns it on his head. And then Sandang Lokta is just like this other guy that's like, I mean, how many times have you read about a torturer and he was your favorite character in the whole series? I'll wait, because it doesn't happen very much. Joe Abercrombie does a fantastic job with character, fantastic job with dialogue in this series. It's not just the main characters, it's also the secondary characters that I think bring this whole world to life. It's the Northmen. It's great. It's just great. And it's right up my alley. It's a really fun time. Number 3 for me is A Song of Ice and Fire by George Martin. I'm going to say the same thing with this one that I would say with Name of the Wind. I am not rating it based on, are we going to get a conclusion? Because frankly, I don't think we will. I'm rating it solely based on what we've got and assuming that we're never going to get anything else. If we have an unfinished series and we're just going to talk about the books that have been released through, Dance with Dragons is the most recent release. That's all we've got, in my opinion, and that's what I'm rating it on. And my God, those books are excellent. Storm of Swords is one of the best fantasy books I've ever read. A Game of Thrones is one of the best fantasy books I've ever read. Clash of Kings is wild, so good. And A Feast for Crows is right there. Like, there are no misses with any of these books, in my opinion. There are some books that are better than others. And Storm of Swords might be, like, genuinely one of the 3 or 4 best fantasy books I've ever read in my life. Like, I think about the pageantry and the world building with this series in a way that I don't with any others. I mean, it is epic fantasy in that you're getting dragon riders and dynasties, and it's got shades of history in it, which probably is just built for me anyway, because I really enjoy history and I really enjoy English history. And apparently George Martin does too, because there's a lot of elements of Wars of the Roses and things like that in these stories. And yet it's characters that keep you coming back, and just like this epic scope that's so hard to get anywhere else. And it's not just the epic scope and the world building and the great character work. It's he's not afraid to kill off a character in service of a higher goal with the story, which I think is very brave and very tough to do. And not many authors do it super well. And George Martin is probably the second best author I've ever read at doing it. I say second because the first one is still yet to be mentioned on the list. I could go on and on about the different threads in here. Like Jaime Lannister's change in character throughout the books is excellent. Tyrion is jumps off the page every single scene he's in. Daenerys, the way she evolves as well. It's fascinating stuff, and it's all blended together in a way that feels almost real, which is just so tough to do. Number 2 for me is the Gentleman Bastard sequence by Scott Lynch. Everybody knows by now, if you have paid attention to my content on TikTok or on here, that Lies of Locke Lamora is my favorite fantasy book for many different reasons. I said on a TikTok video, first impressions are lasting ones. And when you introduce a thief character by saying he's too good at it and too compulsive, and so the guy that employs him to steal stuff has to get rid of him because it's bad for his health that this guy wants to steal so much, that is an incredible opening, and I'm in. And it's not just that. It is the relationship between Locke and Jean that I think is darn near perfect, and maybe the best character relationship in anything I've ever read. I would read him write the phone book. I would read him pretty much doing anything. Scott Lynch can do no wrong in my eyes, and Red Seas Under Red Skies, to my mind, is not a dip in quality from Lies of Locke Lamora. It's perfect stuff. Anytime a book comes out from Scott Lynch, it's comfort reading for me, and I'm just in from the opening pages. It probably is now a broken record, but I'll say the same thing for him that I would for George Martin or Patrick Rothfuss. I would love for there to be more installations in the series, and I think Scott Lynch probably is more likely to release something than the other two. But if we don't get anything else, this would be number 2 for me, because these books are great. Number 1, and I'll be honest, not all that close, is Malazan Book of the Fallen. I've read the first 4 books so far in this series. All of them are excellent individually of one another. Dead House Gates and Memories of Ice are 2 of the best fantasy books I have ever read. House of Chains is incredibly excellent as well. Guards of the Moon is tough, but also cool. It is, I think, not quite as good as the other 3 that I've read so far, but Dead House Gates, oh gosh. The ending of the Chain of Dogs sequence in Dead House Gates, it's peerless, I think, in terms of the way to wrap up a single plot line in a book. Like, it's probably the best singular plot line in a book I have read. But the way that thing wraps up is heart-wrenching and tragic on so many levels, and yet it's incredible. Memories of Ice, I think, from cover to cover is perfect. It's absolutely perfect. Malazan, I'll say this, like, if you haven't read Malazan and you're considering doing it, I want you to know that there are, like, you should expect a couple things. One, it's not going to be for everyone. And I think you should know that and be free in that knowledge, because if you really hate it, that's okay. It just might be that it's not the concoction that you really enjoy in books, and that's totally fine. And if you're going to read it, I think you have to be in the headspace of give it 2 books at least, probably 3, before you decide whether or not you're going to be into it. And I already know, like, there's going to be comments like, if you have to read 3 books to decide if you like it or not, it's not good. No, you're missing the point. That train of logic just doesn't apply to Malazan. And the only way you would know whether or not what I'm saying is true is if you have read the books. If you've read the first 2 and hated it, that's completely fine. It may not be for you, and that's okay. But to throw that line out there without having read it, I'm sorry, you just don't get it. And I don't mean that as a slight to anybody, it's just, it is what it is. Steven Erikson creates truly epic fantasy with stories that feel larger than life and yet also feel part of history and its character. And it's also got like this Hemingway-esque prose to it that it's so stripped back and, as he would say, cagey. It builds in service of this larger story that has payoffs in every book, which I think is also an excellent way to do a series, because in a 10-book series like Malazan, it would be real tough if each book didn't have a payoff of its own. And so far, with each of the first 4 books, there has been a payoff at the end of every book. I almost need to do spoiler talks of each book here, because they're the sort of book that you almost need to decompress after reading. You need to go sit down with a friend and a beer and just word vomit. They do things to you emotionally that you're like, I don't really know how to process this. And I have watched a lot of multi-hour long videos of people doing just that after Dead House Gates, after Memories of Ice, where you word vomit with somebody, because that is what the books do to you. And I think it's really excellent fantasy. That is my top 10 fantasy series as of right now in 2024. If we were to come back to this in a year, things would probably change. And in fact, I would expect that they would change as I read more and get further into these series. Comment below. Tell me what your 10 favorite fantasy series of all time are. I love the discourse that we get when we're talking about fantasy books. And when you're talking about your favorite series, that's no different.